Good afternoon. Welcome to Building Data-Driven Applications with MonoTouch Dialog. In this session, we're going to talk about how to use Xamarin.iOS with C# to be able to create data-driven applications that target the iOS operating system. My name is Mark Smith. I'm an instructor with Developmentor. I author the Building iOS Applications with C# class, as well as several other classes related to UI technologies. I also do some consulting in my spare time with a company called Joelmar.com, where I focus on UI design, parallel programming, and debugging. So to start out with, we're going to talk about MonoTouch Dialog and how it fits into the whole scheme of Xamarin.iOS, how we can actually pull data from various sources and then be able to populate an iOS dialog with this data. We'll talk about different ways of actually managing that data. So it turns out MonoTouch Dialog actually has 3 different mechanisms that you can use to be able to build table view dialogs. And we'll talk about how we can customize those, as well as providing some navigation support. So to begin, MonoTouch Dialog is an API that's designed to build table view dialogs. So if you're not familiar with this, table views happen to be one of the most common UI elements that you'll see in iOS. Most applications that present data use some form of a table view in order to do it. So Xamarin.iOS is a technology that comes from Xamarin.com, which is this company here. They basically provide a native layer on top of either iOS or Android that's built with Mono that allows you to use C# to be able to create applications targeting your mobile devices. With this technology, you can then build cross-platform applications where you can actually target Windows Phone, Android, and iOS with essentially the same code base. It's not a complete portable target in the sense that there will be specific pieces of code that you have to write that target that platform directly. For example, often the UI will change, moving from one platform to another. But generally speaking, it's a fairly complete platform to be able to share business logic between those two platforms. MonoTouch Dialog is an API built into Xamarin.iOS that allows us to create these table views. And so if you look at the settings application, for example, on any iPhone or any iTouch device, you'll see that it actually is a series of choices that you can click through in order to enable or disable settings. That is a table view dialog. In the same way, most applications that present some form of row-based data also use a table view dialog, so it's a very common element. It turns out that MonoTouch Dialog is actually an open source API. It was built specifically because a lot of times when you create table view dialogs, you end up repeating the same code over and over again in order to generate the cells and generate the view itself and then present it over to the UI. And so there was an open source project that was built that sort of automates some of the tasks that are used when we create these dialogs. And that's what we're actually going to take advantage of with this session here. So here's 3 examples of table views. Here you can see one that presents some information along with some configurable switches, one that allows me to enter new information such as a form where I'm creating a new customer, and then even Apple's Reminders app, which allows me to create reminders. And even though each one of these UIs is distinct and very different from each other, all 3 of them are really just using the same underlying iOS feature to be able to create the UI itself. Table views are highly customizable, and MonoTouch Dialog allows you to take advantage of these without creating all the boilerplate code that's necessary to do that. So I mentioned it's an open source project, and you can see the URL here. It's up on GitHub, and you can download the source code today and then look through it to see how it's all put together. However, it is an actual API that's now built into Xamarin.iOS, so it's no longer necessary to actually download source code and build it and add it to your project. It's included as part of the core DLLs that we use as part of iOS itself. And essentially, MonoTouch Dialog builds your screens using 4 pieces. And so you're going to use the DialogViewController class. This is a table view controller, and it's responsible for actually generating the UI that's going to be presented on the phone device itself. To the DialogViewController, you are going to supply a root element. The root element represents a table view. And inside the root element, you will have sections, and each section will have a group of elements. The elements themselves actually represent the table cells that are going to present data to the user. And so these would be things like strings, date containers, sliders, Boolean switches, things like that that the user would then be able to visually see and interact with. There are 3 different mechanisms that MonoTouch Dialog uses to be able to provide data to these tables. The first is the fluent mechanism. This, generally speaking, is the most popular way to actually work with elements. It's very direct. It's actually the model that the other 2 end up generating, and it is essentially an object graph where you create a root element and you populate a series of sections where each section has a series of element objects that are placed inside to be able to drive the UI. However, there are 2 other ways to be able to generate this data. The second way is the reflection mechanism. With the reflection API, you can actually create a class that represents the data that you would like to present, and then you decorate that class with specific attributes telling the system how to generate the UI from the class. This is useful if you have, say, an options dialog or some sort of driving factor that's going to be able to collect the information from the user as they change the data that's presented on the screen. The third model is the JSON model. In this model, you would create your UI using JSON, and then you would present that JSON to the DialogViewController, and the DialogViewController would generate a UI from it. I will show you all 3 in the course of this session here, but let me just give you a really quick example in the slides. So the fluid model builds up the screen by composing an element graph. And so you can see here that we're creating the UI that's presented on the right side of the screen. And in this case, we have a root element where the root element is name account. And then we have a section with no title that has a Boolean element inside of it. That Boolean element has a title of airplane mode, and it's initially set to the checked state. That generates a UI switch that you see there on the right-hand side. And so that is a table view cell that has a text element and then has a UI switch element placed into it. And the UI switch is then set to the true state. We then create a second section with the header login, and we create 2 entry elements. Entry elements allow me to tap on the item itself and then get the keyboard to be able to change the actual data presented in the value. And so you can see here we have a login element and a password element. Both of them have a watermark text. One says enter your username, the second says enter your password, and both are initially set to the empty string value. And so you can see we have no value in those cells themselves. The second entry element has a third optional parameter passed to true, which causes the actual element to generate a mask character instead of the actual characters that you type, so it becomes a password field. The third section has a header of seat preference, and then it has a new root element in it where it's creating a radio group. Now, remember I said that root elements create table views. And so in this case, when I have a root element inside of a section, that will actually be a navigation view where when I tap on that item, it would present a new table view, allowing me to select from one of 3 choices. In this case here, window, squished, or aisle to represent my seat preference that I'd like to have. This is the Fluent API where I'm essentially composing a series of objects and then linking them together in order to present my UI. The second model is the reflection model. This works off of a single class that I would then present to the MonoTouch Dialog system itself. That class is decorated with a series of attributes that are used to control the UI generation. And so you can see here I'm effectively creating the exact same UI that we did earlier with the Fluent model. And so I have an airplane mode Boolean, I have a username string, a password string, and a seat preference enumeration that will then generate a set of radio elements in a secondary table view. And so notice the attributes decorate the elements themselves, decorate the properties, and those then create the headers and allow me to control things like the keyboard style and whether or not it's a password field or a regular text field. And then the section element simply is used to separate each one of these items. And so you can see I get a login section and a seat preference section, just as we did before. We will look at this model as well. The third model and final model is the JSON model. In this model here, notice that we use a JSON string. And so this JSON body here that we're creating has a predefined form that you can look at online to be able to see exactly what the form is. But essentially it is the root element with the title property and then a sections array that has a series of elements in it. And so you can see we've got several things in here, and we are again recreating the exact same UI, but this time with the JSON model. Now, when we actually create the MonoTouch dialog, the first step is to create a dialog view controller. This is simply a table view controller that loads our data. And so you can see here I'm creating a dialog view controller and I'm supplying the root element that's going to actually populate this dialog view with data. I'm then setting that dialog view controller as the root view controller This would be done, of course, in my app delegate that would then present this as my main page from the application itself. The constructor of the DialogViewController takes a root element, and then, of course, we can always change the root element at a later point in time, which would cause the table view to refresh its contents. There are also properties on the root element itself that allow you to reload the data if you desire. When we create a root element, it's used to create a single table view, and it always holds a series of section elements. And so really, the root element always holds sections, and then the sections themselves hold the actual table view cells that are going to present information. We have an optional parameter to the root element that will provide a title if we're in a navigation view. And so if this DialogViewController is actually owned by a UI navigation controller, then the parameter passed to the root element would be the title placed into the navigation bar that's presented upon the top of the application section itself. Each section also can have an optional header and an optional footer that's used to present information both above and below the items that are used as part of the section. And so in this case, notice that we've got a login header that's being used here. You can pass in a string, or you can actually even use a custom UI view if you'd like to be able to put additional bits of information into it. For instance, to have other UI things such as images or things like that to make up your header. Each section is then populated with elements, one or more. And so notice here we've got 2 entry elements and a Boolean element to be able to register our login and our password and whether or not we'd like to remember that login. It is important to recognize that the element graph itself and everything in it is mutable. So in other words, if I change these elements at runtime, those changes would then be pushed over to the UI to reflect whatever changes I've made. In addition, if the user then switches some of these elements, for example, if they change the Boolean element and they switch it to false, I can then reread those values back out of this element graph in order to then persist that data someplace within my application. Now you might be asking at this point, well, what sorts of things can I actually place into a section? Well, turns out that MonoTouch Dialog has a fairly flexible set of element types that pretty much allow you to do almost anything. And so the most common types that we'll use are going to be things like string element that present a caption and a value. There's also a styled string element that allow me to present a caption value and let me control the font and the color and information like that. And then we have a multi-line element. We have entry elements that allow me to populate with a keyboard editable field. We have Boolean elements that present a switch, a UI switch, a checkbox element that lets me put a check on there, an activity element that lets me actually show a progress ring that's going to spin around, a set of radio elements that allow me to do mutual exclusive entry selection. So in this case here I have 3 entries and I can only select one of them and the check will move between the 3 entries. I have badge elements that let me put a badge onto the cell itself, so this would just be an image. And by the way, you can place an image on some of the other elements as well, and so it has an image property. We have a float element to generate a slider, a date element, a time element, and a date time element that allow me to pick either a date, a time, or both together as a normal date picker UI. An HTML element that allows me to navigate to a web page, and so it becomes a tappable cell that when I tap it, it would actually navigate to a web browser page that would then display whatever the URL is associated with it. We have a message element that gives me the same sort of UI as the email program message, and so here I have a title and a detail and a subtitle, as well as an ability to put a glyph and an actual accessory item. And then we have the load more element that allows me to present a progress ring that to indicate that I'm actually loading data. And then finally, we can actually create a custom UI view element where I can put whatever UI view here I'd like. And in this case, I'm able to create any sort of custom view and actually place it inside the table view cell. And then finally, you'll notice that on the internet, this is a fairly active community. There are a lot of people that have actually built custom element types by either deriving from one of these or just creating their own to be able to manage some particular type of data that wasn't necessarily easy to do with one of these pre-built types here. And so you can customize the elements themselves to be able to create any sort of UI that you'd like. For example, perhaps what I like is an actual chat balloon element where I'm creating something similar to the messages application, and so I'm presenting each item as a little chat balloon. In that case, what I can do is derive from the base element type and then present whatever UI I'd like as part of the override for the getCell method. So the getCell method is equivalent to the table source getCell, where I would actually create some sort of UI table view cell that's then going to have the UI composed inside of it to be able to generate whatever I like inside that cell itself. Notice it is reusable just like a normal table view cell would be if I were building my own table source. The difference is in order to use this, I simply insert it into the element graph and add it to a section, and then the system would automatically compose that view for me. So this is quite handy and nice. Let's take a look at an example of how to use this system. So I'm going to switch over to Xamarin Studio, and I'm going to go ahead and open up an existing application that I have here. Now I just want to show you this application very quickly in order for you to understand exactly what's put together here. So you can see here that we've got a nib file that's been created here called Options App View Controller. And what I've done is just create a real quick application that I'll show you real quickly here. And it's got a name and then it's got a setting, and I'm assuming it's some kind of audio detection application where I've basically able to save off this setting, and I can say what noise filters allowed, the background noise detection, 3D sound detection, and then what the current decibel level that's allowed here is. And so this will be the UI that we actually fill out. The view controller that's behind it, you can see, basically it's very standard C# here. And so I've got all those controls in my nib file wired up to specific fields here, so setting label and max level label, background detect label, 3D sound label, and so I'm setting the text for each one of these. And then I have a button that's at the bottom there that allows me to then change these options, which I don't have any data in right now, but that's exactly what we're going to fill out. If I run this app, you can see that it just takes an existing sound settings that I have set up here, and it just populates this dialog with the sound settings fields. And so I'm going to be able to click this button and then be able to change some of those settings. So the dialog itself is actually just populated from this sound settings class, and you can see here that it has a string name, has a safety level, a background music detection boolean, a use 3D sound detection boolean, a max decibels allowed floating value, and then it just sets it to some default values here. Now our goal is to be able to populate this into a table view so that the user would then be able to change all of these values and then cause those values to then show up when we back to the main screen again. And so in order to do this, I have a couple of things that we're going to do. First, I'm going to add a new screen into this application. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm just going to go ahead and add a new file in here, and I'm going to call it an empty class, and I'm going to call it sound settings viewcontroller.cs. All right, and I'm going to take this class and I'm going to derive it from DialogViewController. So remember, this is the class that comes from MonoTouch Dialog, and so I have to go ahead and use MonoTouch Dialog here in order to get it. Now, it requires that we actually pass in a root element to my base here. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do is just create a new root element. Actually, we don't have to do that. We can just pass in null. All right, so I'm just going to pass in null. And I'm going to assume that you're going to hand me a sound settings that this class should then show a UI from. And so let's go ahead and create a sound settings. I'm just going to call it settings. And I'm going to pass it in to the constructor. And then we'll just go ahead and set the field here. So settings will be equal to settings. Now what I need to do is now create a root element from this settings. Now when we're using the reflection model, which is what we're going to use here because I have a nice object that represents all of my state, what we need to do is we need to create something called a binding context. And so I'm going to create a new binding context up here. I'm going to call it binding context. And let's just capture that field here. And let's create one of those as well. So I'm just going to say new binding context. And notice what we pass it is an object for callbacks. I'm going to leave that null for just a moment. We're going to pass in our settings, which is the object we want to read the values from. And then I can give it a title. All right, so I'm going to call it sound settings. Now when we create a binding context, what this will do is this will then use reflection against the object that we supply, this second object here, and it will generate a root element for me. And so all I have to do is say this.root is equal to binding context.root. Okay, and so this is the generated root element that includes all of the sections and elements based upon whatever that dialog actually has in it. Now, I'm going to go ahead and build this. I'm going to take this view controller here, and let's go ahead and go back to our options app view controller, and let's create one of these here. So I'm just going to say new view controller, and I need to pass in my sound settings. Now, I already have my sound settings. It's actually a local field here. Recall that we have one that's been created as part of our option view, app view controller here. And so I'm going to go ahead and create one of these sound settings here. And then when I create it, we can go ahead and present this as a view. So I'm just going to say this, present view controller. I pass in the view controller that I'd like to use, and so we'll just call this VC. And then I say that I'd like it to be animated, and I don't need a completion handler for this. So the completion handler that you pass here is what gets called when the animation is complete. So it's when the second view is now presented on the screen. Is there any work that we'd like to do? In this case, there isn't, and so that's all I actually need to do for this. Let's go ahead and run this just to see how it works without us doing any customization at all. And so this is going to come up in the simulator, and I'm going to go ahead and click my little button here. This presents my new view, and notice that I have my data here, and I can see my background music detection is off, use 3D detection is off, my sliders over here, I have a name of sample settings and a safety level of normal. If I tap in the name here, I don't have any ability to edit this. Okay, so it just took that string and assumed it was just read-only text, and so by default, unless I tell it otherwise, it just assumes this is read-only text that we're going to view here. Notice I can tap safety level, and it does pop up a new dialog, but I have no provision of getting back. All right, so our app is officially busted here. And the reason it's busted is because we don't actually have a navigation controller that's doing any sort of navigation work for us. So typically, if you use MonoTouch Dialog, then often what you'll want to do is go ahead and use a navigation controller as part of this. And so I'm going to change this here, and I'm going to say this is now navigation controller. This will now be my root element. And I'm just going to go ahead and set my view controller to be a new UI navigation controller, where I pass in that options view controller as the second view. Okay? And let's just run it one more time here just to see what happens just by doing that. And so again, the simulator will come up. I press my button here, and now notice that I have my name and sample settings, and if I click sample level, it doesn't actually appear to be fixed here. All right, so even though we set this as a UI navigation controller, that actually didn't fix our problem. And the reason why is because right now we're actually using the wrong API to do this. All right, so when you use present view controller, you're presenting what's referred to as a modal view. And so you have to provide the UI logic to get back to the caller. All right, so we're going to go ahead and delete this, and instead we're going to go ahead and use the built-in navigation view controller. Now I'm going to do it in a slightly different way, just for fun, to be able to keep the same kind of animation that we have here. And so I'm going to say UI view animate, do it in 1/4 second, and let's pass in a delegate that we're going to use for this animation. And so I'm going to go ahead and set up a couple of animation elements here. I'm going to set the animation curve to be UI view animation curve dot, and let's go ahead and use ease in out so that we get both sides of the animation. And then let's go ahead and set navigation controller dot, and let's go ahead and push our view controller. I'm going to go ahead and push the view controller, but I'm going to say don't animate on your own because now we're providing the animation. And then we go ahead and say UI view set animation transition, and we're going to set an animation transition of, and let's just do a flip from left. All right. And then let's go ahead and give it the view. And so I'm going to say navigation controller dot view. And I'm going to say do not cache it. So false for the cache itself. All right, now this will cause my system to animate and present this new view controller. Now the thing is I'm going to need some facility for it to actually get back to me. All right, so I need some facility to dismiss this. And so I'm going to go ahead and put another method right here on this class here, and I'm just going to call it onDismiss. And you'll see how we call it in just a moment. And I'm just going to copy this code that we already have. And I'm just going to paste it in here. Except instead of doing the push view controller, what I'm going to do is a pop view controller. All right, so we'll just pop it back off again. And I just want pop view controller. And when we do this pop view controller, what we're going to do is just say don't bother to animate it. Even though we have an animated suffix on here, we're actually not going to animate it. All right, and in this case, what we want to do is we're going to go ahead and do a flip from right instead of left. All right, so we'll do it the opposite direction when we do this. All right, and that'll be used to actually dismiss it. So now I've got those two pieces in place. Now let's go fix up our sound settings. And so recall I told you that the way that we're going to actually configure this is we're going to use attributes to kind of manage this. And so I'm going to go to this and I'm going to say I want this to be an entry element. And so we're going to say enter settings name. So that'll be what we want to actually save it as. All right, and let's go ahead and pull in our proper namespace. That's MonoTouch.dialog. And notice we have a couple other things we can do with this. So I can also say set the keyboard type, and in this case it's going to be a UI keyboard type, dot. And then I could say, for instance, that I want it to be numbers or email addresses or decimals or numbers and punctuation or phone or Twitter or URL web search. In this case, let's just go ahead and use the default since we want to be able to specify names. I'm going to go ahead and kill the namespace off that and we'll include it just above. So we'll go ahead and let it add a namespace up above there. And so that'll make sure that we can now edit the name. Let's go ahead and take our safety level. Let's just split some of this out. And what I'd like to do is put a section here. And so I'm going to create a section, and let's say this is the advanced features here. And so I'm just going to decorate just above background music that I'd like a section element. That's going to put some spacing between them, and it's going to create a separate group here. And we'll go ahead and have those two booleans. Then let's go ahead and create another section. But in this case, I'm not going to give it any text, which will just be some blank space between the advanced section here and this max decibels allowed. And then what I'd like to do is go ahead and say the range for max decibels allowed is going to be 10 to 100. Okay, so this is pretty much the high-end range of what we'd like to have. And then this would be the low range of what we want. And that will constrain that slider that you saw to be within this range here. Then I can do things like set the alignment to UI text alignment. Let's go ahead and just say I want it to be centered. All right, so I want the actual text for this, or the element itself to be centered. All right. And then what we can do is we can go ahead and put on here, actually not on this, let's leave the range on there. And let's actually put on here a header. So let's say max decibels, it's ELS, allowed. And then let's put a footer on here as well. We'll say adjust the sensitivity of the test. Okay, so that'll be the footer that we use there. All right, and there's no text on this, and so we don't need a text alignment. But let's put a text alignment on the next thing here. So we'd like to be able to dismiss this dialog. Now remember what happens if we just put a string in here. If I just put a string with the name finished, it will actually create me a string element that it will place into that dialog that will just have the text finished. And here what I'm going to do is go ahead and say I'd like that text to be centered. And so we will use our alignment tag here to do that. And let's go ahead and put a blank section in front of this one so we have some spacing between this string here and then this section up here that we have. All right, so that'll make sure that those are all set there. Okay, and then last but not least, let's go ahead and say when you tap this, then I want to go ahead and call onDismiss. Okay, so recall we created a method called onDismiss in our options view controller right here. And so I'm saying when you tap this field here that's going to get created, I want it to go ahead and call this method. Let's go ahead and build that, make sure it builds. We have a warning. It's probably related to our icon or something though. Yeah, so settings is not assigned. That's okay. And so we're going to go ahead and set this up to be able to call onDismiss. Now, let's go ahead and go back to our options view controller here. And remember, one of the things that we needed on our sound settings here, we didn't supply anything for it, but the very first parameter going to this binding context was something called callbacks. Whenever binding context runs across an onTap attribute applied to a field or a property of a class, then it assumes that the onTap is going to call a method, and that method has to exist on this callback object. And so I'm going to go ahead and pass in a second object here. I'm just going to call it context. And I'm going to assume that that's where all your callback methods are actually located. And so we'll call this context here as well. And then in our options app view dialog, let's just pass in this as the context. And actually it's the second parameter. All right, so we'll pass in the context to our sound settings view controller. Let's build that, and let's see how this works now. So again, run it inside the simulator. All right, we go to our dialog here. Now it flips over. I have sample settings. I can change this name. So I can say, for example, samples. All right, and then I can change my safety level to say minimum. Notice I now have a navigation view up here. I can turn on my background music detection and drop the max decibels allowed, and notice that we now have a finish button down here. When I tap the finish button, it's going to actually call the on dismiss that will animate us back. Okay, so we end up back on the main page. Now notice that none of our features appear to have been supplied here. So we don't see anything on the title, we don't see our normal noise filter or background detection. None of that's been set. Well, the reason none of that's been set is because we didn't actually reread the values. And so here, when this view is actually being shut down, we need to go back to this binding context and we have to tell it, go and fetch the current state of the UI and plug it back into our sound settings. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to override one more method here of view did disappear, or actually just view will disappear. And inside my view will disappear, let's go ahead and go to the binding context and let's say fetch. This will cause it to then read all the UI changes and apply them back to that sound settings. So let's run this app one more time just to see what happens. Alright, so we come in here, we change our safety level, turn on background music and use 3D sound, change our decibels, come up here and click finished. Oh, and we need to reread the value here too. Okay, so one other thing we need to do, which is right now the data is being loaded in view did load. Let's change that. Instead of view did load, let's use view did appear. Alright, so when this view first appears, this has an animated property on it. Let's say view did appear. Let's pass in animated. Oops. And let's go ahead and load our state then. Third time's always the charm. All right. So minimum, oops, minimum, check, 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 finished, and boom. You can see we now have background minimum or background detection, 3D sound detection, minimum noise filter set, and we have our value 20.28571. This is coming directly off that floating point value that was adjusted by the slider. Okay. Now the key thing to recognize is all I did was to load up a DialogViewController. In fact, we didn't even need to really create this class, right? The reality is I could have just created a DialogViewController directly and then manage that binding context fetch right here in the onDismiss, right? So when it called onDismiss, I could have done a fetch right here using a binding context. So there was no need for me to even derive from DialogViewController. I could have created just a DialogViewController, passed in the settings object, held on to the binding context right here, and then used it right here in my dismiss, and that would have worked just fine. Okay, so this is using the reflection model. Now, I want to do something slightly more complicated. And so I'm going to add a new project into here. Let's create a single view application again, and I'm going to call this Course Viewer. Let's make sure this is a iPhone single view application, Course Viewer, and there we go. I say OK. Creates me a single view application here, and I'm just going to delete the two, the Course Viewer controller. Actually, I don't even need to delete both of them. I'm just going to delete the second one, the nib file. I don't want a nib file for this, and I'm going to delete the partial designer file as well. So we're going to get rid of both of those and just keep our Course View controller here. Then I'm going to add another project into this solution that will help us to be able to pull some data. So I have an existing C# project here that I've already built. This was actually built with Visual Studio, and in fact we could have even shared it just as a DLL if we used, say, the portable class library template that allows me to then take a single assembly at the binary level or at the IL level and then share it across different target types such as Silverlight, Windows Phone, iOS, or Android when using Xamarin. So you can see here that it just has 4 classes in it, 3 of which are just data transfer objects. And so these are just going to represent data structures that we're going to pass back from a web service. And so I have a course data structure, a grouping data structure for categorizing courses, an engagement data structure that just tells me when classes start and end, and then I have just a course reader that's going to use JSON against a couple of URLs and be able to pull this data back. And so notice that there are 2 methods here, one called getCourses that returns me a task of courses, and then a get engagements for course, passing in a course ID that returns me the engagements for that course. All right, so we're going to use this inside of our course viewer. Now, before we get started, let's just go ahead and make one real quick change to this, which is we know we're going to want navigation. So let's just go ahead and add in a navigation controller. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and change this to be able to just use a new UI navigation controller, and we'll pass in our course viewer view controller as the main class that's going to get used there. Now, inside this course viewer view controller, we're going to go ahead and change this to be a DialogViewController, just like we did before. And let's add a reference to MonoTouch dialog and then add our using statement. So I'm just using a hotkey of Alt-Enter within Xamarin Studio to get that. And then let's go ahead and call our base class, and we'll just pass in, again, null. I keep wanting to type new root element and just pass in a null root element, but null suffices as well. And then I can just delete these two existing overrides that are here. Now, on this course view controller, let's go ahead and first add in some support to be able to read this data. So I'm going to go ahead and add a method that's going to be used to actually load our data. And I'm going to go ahead and mark this method as an async method. And I'm just going to return a task, and we're going to just call it load data. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to use our JSON course reader. So let's just create a course reader. We'll say new JSON course reader. And I'm going to use this new JSON course reader, and I'm basically going to go ahead and load up my data from the web service. So I need to of course reference both the DLL, this class library that I have built, as well as add the DM courses data namespace up here. So again, Alt-Enter will do that for me. Now, we might also need to get rid of that void. We actually want to return a task, system threading tasks. Okay, so let's go ahead and create our course reader, and then let's load our courses. All right, and to load my courses, I'm basically just going to do an await on the course reader, get courses. All right, so this will return me all the courses. Now, this await keyword, if you're not familiar with it, this is a new C#5 feature, and it allows me to essentially provide some asynchronous execution on this single thread. So essentially, the UI thread will continue execution while this code right here, get courses, goes off and hits that web service on a background thread. And then the UI thread will come back and begin executing the remainder of this method once we've actually retrieved the courses. Now, once I have my courses, what we're going to want to, of course, create is our root element to represent this. And so let's go ahead and create a new root element. Let's give it the name Developmentor Courses. All right, and inside this root element, we're going to go, of course, create a series of sections. Now, if you recall, my course itself actually has here a grouping. So there's a primary course group of course DTO. This has got a name in it that we can actually use to represent the course itself. And so let's go ahead and go back to our view controller, and let's group our data coming back using just a simple link expression. So we can say courses group by. Now notice I don't have that in my IntelliSense, and so I need a use system link here. And then I can say group this by primary course group. And if it comes back null, then I'm just going to go ahead and supply an empty course group here. Hopefully we have course groups for each one, but just on the off chance that I don't, I'm going to go ahead and say let's group it by either empty or by the name itself. Now, once I've got this grouped, then we can start selecting data off of this. And so I'm going to say select the course group, and off of that, let's create a new section. And let's go ahead and use the key, which of course will be either this empty or it'll be this primary course group name. That'll be the actual heading for this section. All right, and then let's go ahead and on this section, let's go ahead and add a footer. And so the footer that we're going to use for this section will be the count coming back from this. All right, plus, let's just say courses. All right, so that'll be our footer that we'll use for this particular section. And then let's go ahead and set our elements. The elements will be our course group with a select, and we'll take each course and let's go ahead and create a new styled string element. Now, styled string element, if you recall, I mentioned this earlier, is essentially an element that allows me to kind of customize the font and the image and things like that I might actually include on this. And so let's go ahead and use the name of the course as the data that we put inside the styled string element. And then actually notice that we can also pass in a delegate here indicating what we should do if the user taps this. And so let's just go ahead and put in here a method call to retrieve the course details for this. So I'm just going to call this onSelectCourse, and let's just go ahead and pass the course into that. Now this of course needs to be created. Oops, I didn't mean to actually build that. I hit the wrong hotkey there. So let's go ahead and detach from that. And let's use Alt-Enter, not Alt-Build, and let's just create a little method right here. All right, and so this will just basically return nothing. All right, so we don't really have any data to return, but we will pass in the course that we want there. Okay, now it's kind of freaking out because I haven't closed off my parenthesis here yet. All right, now the other things that we'd like to put into this styled string element, let me just move it down one line here so we can kind of see better what's going on. And that'll be the end of my select. The other thing I want to set on here is an accessory. And so we'll set that to be a disclosure indicator. All right, so the disclosure indicator will put a nice little arrow next to this to indicate that it's tappable. And then what we can do is we can actually add an image onto this. Now, in order to do this, I'm going to have to put some specific images in here. So I'm going to come back to that because I don't think I have the images, and so we'll create some, or I'll make sure to put it into the final solution. But essentially what we could do is just set an image based upon whether this is a favorite or not. But I don't believe that I actually created the images yet. I'd like to put a little star there. And so when you download this code off of my blog later, you'll see that I'll just have an image statement in there to do that. In fact, we could type it here. It won't hurt anything. We could say C is favorite. And then just say if we have that, then we can do a UI image dot load, or actually, I'm sorry, from bundle. All right, so we'll go ahead and use the cached images, and we can say favorite image. All right, so we'll just do favorite, or I'll go ahead and load up UI image from bundle, not favorite. Okay, and so I just need to put a couple of images in there to do that. And then the last thing let's do is let's go ahead and set the font, because I told you you could. And so let's go ahead and say UI font, system font of size. And let's go ahead and use system font of size, and let's go ahead and use like a 12-point font. Okay. Now, then let's take all this and let's just go ahead and cast this to elements. All right, so that we get all elements, and then let's do a toList on it in order to actually pull all of our data back. All right, then on the end of our select, that'll be the end of our select there. And then finally, we'll have a closing brace for the root element itself that we'll put a semicolon on, and then we can actually set the the root element itself. So we'll just say this dot root is equal to what we just created. Now this will automatically set the root, and therefore all my data will load up from this. Now the problem is this is asynchronous. And so when I call this method here, it's going to wait a moment before we can actually retrieve data. And I don't know how long that will be because I'm pulling it from a web service. And so it all depends upon how far away we are from that service and how much data is loading and that sort of thing. So what I'd like to do is I'd actually like to initialize this in a slightly different way. So let's go ahead and call load data here as part of our constructor, and that will allow it to then load asynchronously, and then we'll set the root when we have it. But I'd like to have some specific root here before we actually start. And so let's just create another method that returns a root element. And what I'm going to return for this, let's just call this generate animating element. All right, and we're going to make this static since we don't need an instance method for this. And what I'm going to do when I generate this animating element is I'm going to go ahead and generate a UI animation indicator. And so basically it's just one of the little progress ring spinners that you can use inside iOS. And what we can actually create here is what's called an activity element. So this is, again, another element style that you can use in MonoTouch Dialog. And so when we create this, let's just go ahead and create our root element. Let's use the same heading that we did before. So I'm going to take this string that we already created here for the courses, and I'm just going to use Alt-Enter, and I'm going to say go ahead and declare this as a local variable, and we'll call this header. And then I'm going to go ahead and take this and make it a constant string and just move it out into a global scope here. All right, so we'll stick it into a global scope, and that way I can use this same header right here. All right, and then let's go ahead and in this root itself, let's go ahead and create a new section. All right, because remember, every element or every root element has to have a section on it. And so on the section itself, I'm not going to put any data, but let's put inside the section a new activity element. Okay, and so this activity element that we're going to use here, we don't need any parameters to it, but we can go ahead and set some specific properties on it. So notice it has an animating property. We can set that to true. We can also set a caption on this, and so let's set that to loading data. Okay, and then finally I have some flags that I can put on this. And so I'm going to go ahead and set the transparent flag to indicate that I don't want it to draw any background on this particular activity element. And then we can actually just return this. All right, so I don't need to actually put this into a variable. I can just return it directly from my generating animating element. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this method here, and I'm just going to call it, instead of passing in null, let's actually just call generate animating element. And that will then cause a little spinner while we're loading our data. And as soon as the data is loaded, this method here will go ahead and set the root element, and therefore we'll go ahead and get the root element as part of our data. All right, let's go ahead and build this, and let's run it and see what happens. So we're going to run it inside the simulator. So it should come up. Could not load nib and bundle. Hold on. All right, so we shouldn't have that constructor anymore. And it's loading new course view controller there. Oh, but just make sure we don't have anything here. Nope, that's all good. Let's rebuild this. There it goes. Okay, so notice we got our little loading activity indicator. It was spinning, and then we got our courses here. And I can see that my heading on it is Application Architecture and Design Training. And then I have my 3 entries here that are under that. And then it says 3 courses, that's my footer. And then I have .NET Development Training with a bunch of .NET courses here. Right, and I can slide through this, and then there's 21 courses there, Agile, Software, C++. All right, and you can see that it just generated me a nice little table view that actually has all this data in it. And then I can actually pick one here, and I can basically just select one, and then it would fire off that onSelected event. All right, so let's go ahead and fix that up. So when we select one, what I'd like to do is actually load details for this specific course here. And so let's go ahead and create another table view to actually represent our course details. And so let's just create a class. I'm going to call this course details view controller. Right, and this again will be a dialog view controller. All right, and we'll have a constructor on it. And let's have the constructor take a course DTO. All right, let's go ahead and put that course into a field. So I'm going to stick it in a field at the top of the class here. And then let's go ahead and call our base, and then let's set on this just a null. All right, so I don't actually want it to have any data. However, I would actually like this to be grouped, and so I'd like it to be actually separated a little more than the other one is. And so notice that there's a second constructor here that takes a table style, and so I can say UI table view style dot grouped, and then pass in null for my data. And then the other thing that I'd like to do is I'd like to say that this has been pushed. And so when we actually come to this view controller, I'm going to push this onto the navigation stack, which means I want to make sure that it shows the header. All right, so I'm going to set true on this last parameter to indicate that we're actually using this in a navigation sort of style. So let's go ahead and set the title to be the course name. And then I'm going to go ahead and generate some course details. All right, so let's just say generate course details. So it'll just be a method that we create here. All right, and inside this method, we'll use that course field that we created. And let's go ahead and make this an async method as well. that returns a task, only because I want to actually read the engagements for this. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and create another JSON course reader. So we'll create another JSON course reader, and then let's go ahead and load up our data. So let's say root is equal to new root element. We'll use the course name as the actual element itself. And when we're done, we're just going to we're going to set the root to this root element. All right, so we'll go ahead and replace our null with the details here. Let's go ahead and create a new section with no data in it. And inside the section, let's go ahead and set a new string element. So string element, remember, is just a read-only piece of text where we'll set the name of the course and course.name. Let's create a second string element where we've got the details for the course. All right, and what we'll do is we'll go ahead and, for this one, let me just pass in nothing for the moment. And what we'll do is we'll go ahead and have this push off to a new view controller. And then I'm going to put an HTML element as the last one. And this will be more info. So we'll go ahead and pass in the URL for the course. This will actually take us to a web page for this particular course based upon if the user taps this item, HTML element, it'll take us to a URL that'll be the web browser for that URL that we passed it. For my second section, so I'm going to add another section in here. Let's go ahead and create a section called upcoming classes that will fill in, okay? And then let's finally create a final section here, and let's call this description. Now, for description, I'm going to go ahead and put some data into this. And what I'd like to do is actually create an inline view. Now, the problem is the description that we actually have passed in here. If you look at this, the course actually has a description on it, has details and description, but both of those are actually HTML elements. In other words, it's just inline HTML, and we don't have an element to actually do that. So let's just real quickly create one. I mentioned that you can actually create your own inline, you can create your own elements if you like, and so I'm just going to create a new view to be able to display HTML inline, and I'm just going to call it an inline HTML view. I'm going to derive this from UI web view. Okay, so this is a built-in class that allows me to display a web page. Let's create a constructor on this, and let's just pass in the HTML data that we'd like to have displayed, and let's go ahead and also pass in the rectangle frame. All right, so this will be how big we would like this element to be. Then when we have our data, let's just go ahead and call this load HTML string. We pass it the HTML data, and I don't need to pass it a URL, so we'll just pass in null for that. All right. Now, for this, let's go ahead and call the base class, and let's pass that frame to the base class itself. So that'll be my view. Now, I could have actually created this as an element style, but I'm actually going to use the built-in UI element style to be able to do this. All right, so on my description here for the element, I'm going to create a new UI view element. All right, so remember I told you this is a way to just use any view that you like. I don't need a caption on it, but let's go ahead and create our new inline HTML view. Let's pass the actual description of the course, and let's give it a new rectangle. And we'll pass in 00 view bounds width, and then let's just say we want it to be 200 pixels high. All right, and then we'll go ahead and say we don't need it to be transparent. All right, so that'll be my description that we're actually going to display here. Now, on the details, I want to do something similar here, except I'm going to display an actual web page for this. And so the problem again is if I use HTML element like I did here, it has to be a URL. And I don't have a URL on the details. Instead, what I have is just HTML text. We could do this exact same thing right here that we did with description and display it inline, but I'd like you to be able to tap it to be able to go to that page. And so let's just create ourselves another view controller here. We're going to call it Web View Controller, and I'm just going to derive it from View Controller. All right, so that's the standard View Controller class that's built into iOS. Let's create a constructor on this and have the constructor take our HTML text. All right, so let's go ahead and cache that off into a field inside of our class. And then inside here, let's just set the title to be course details. All right, so I've got my HTML text. Let's go ahead and override the view did load. So this method is called when the view actually loads. And when we have this, let's just go ahead and create ourselves a new web view. I'm going to go ahead and cache that off in the field as well. So we'll call this new UI web view. Let's create that. Web view is equal to new UI web view. And for this web view, let's just set our bounds. All right, so that'll be the frame that we'd like to use. And then let's load it up. So load HTML string just like we did before, and we'll pass in HTML text and null. So we, again, don't need a URL for this. All right, then let's go ahead and add this to our subviews. And so this add method is on the view controller. It's just a helper method. And so notice what it takes is just a view, and it just adds it to the view that's of this particular view controller. So this view controller has a view, it adds it to the subviews for this. It's equivalent to saying view.addSubview and then passing in the view. All right, and that should be all we need to do. Let's take this web view controller and come down here to our details. And when you actually click on the details, what I like to do is instead of passing in a null string, notice I can pass in an action for when you tap on this. And so I'm going to go ahead and say, for this action, let's call navigation controller dot push view controller. Okay, so we'll push a new view controller. Let's create a new UI web view controller, this new thing that we just created, passing in our course details. All right, so that's the HTML text that we'd like to have. And then we'll say we would like to be animated. That's fine. Close off our two parentheses. And then put a comma there. Actually, I don't need to do that. I think we can do this. So that's for the view controller. Let's put a semicolon, close that off, and then close that off, and put a comma. There we go. All right, so there's our new view controller. All right, now, for our course reader here, so we're going to go ahead and set the root. And then let's do this. And in fact, I don't need this course reader until I'm a little further down in the code. That was a little premature of me to put that there. Let's actually move it down here. So once I've loaded all the data, right, so I've got all my pieces loaded and I've set my root, then let's load the actual engagements for this. And so I'm going to say courses is equal to, and let's take our course ID. So we'll say from in await, and let's take our course reader and say get engagements for course.id. All right, so we'll go ahead and pass in the course ID. And then let's do a select on that to go ahead and pull back a new string element. So for each one of these courses, we'll create a string element, and let's just set the string element to be the start date to short date string. All right, so we use the short date string as the header, and then let's just do a string.format. And we'll say we'd like the city, the country, and then let's say X number of days. Okay, so we'll do a CD city, CD country, and CD it's days, length in days. That's what I want right there. All right, so that'll be the format string that we actually use here. Let's close off our string format and close off our from, put a semicolon. There we go. So that'll give me all my courses back. And again, we've got our nice little await here, which means our UI thread will be off doing UI stuff. And then when we actually finally have our data, it'll come back to us and we'll load up our courses. Let's take all this data. Let's then cast it to element types, because that's what we know is going to be there. And then let's do a toList on it to go ahead and execute that. And so now once we've got that, we can say if courses.count is greater than 0, then we're going to go ahead and load up some data. Else, let's load up just an empty tag saying there's no data there. So we'll go to our root element, go to the second section rather, so index 1, and let's just say add. We'll use add all, and we'll say courses. All right, so that'll add all the courses in. Otherwise, let's say root 1 add, and let's create a new string element where we basically pass in and say none. Okay? So that'll then add in a single element called none. And then finally, let's add in a new one. Add new string element. And let's just have a little fun. Let's say call for onsite. All right, so, and then we'll pass in a delegate where we do UI application, shared application, open URL, and let's go ahead and pass in a new URL. In fact, we'll use NSURL dot from string, and let's pass in the string telephone, and then I don't know what Developmentor's telephone number is. So let's go find that. So we'll go to Developmentor's website here, contact, and let's just pick up the US-based telephone number. So there it is right there. Come back here and let's paste that in. Get rid of the dashes because it doesn't like dashes or spaces. And then that will be what we actually open up. Let's close off our open URL, close off the new string element, and I think that's all we need. Semicolon. Okay. And so that'll add in a new call for onsite here that has our engagements. Now, I've got my course details view controller. Let's use it. So up here, when we actually tap this item, so when we create these courses themselves, we've got this new styled string element. We're calling this onSelectCourse. In onSelectCourse, what we'd like to do is actually navigate to this new item. And so when we navigate to this new item, what we'll do is we'll basically say navigation controller, push view controller, just like we did before. Let's pass in a new course details view controller, passing in the course, right, that we just got passed, and let's just say go ahead and animate that. And that should be all we have to do. Let's build that. Let's run it again, see what we get. All right, so there it goes, loading data. We have all our items. Let's pick advanced.net. And then notice I get name, details, more info. I get upcoming classes. I even have a description down here that indicates the description for the data itself. If I click details, it actually takes me to our UI web view. Notice I still have a back here, and I can see this is all HTML in here. I can go back. I can go more info. It would take me to the web page. All right, so you can see it loads up my web page. And then, of course, I could call for onsite. That doesn't work in the simulator, but you get the idea. And so this now gives me a nice data-driven application where all I really had to write was some specific logic to pull the data itself, and then the system actually built all the table view contents for me. So I just created a series of object graphs here using root element, section, and then a series of elements, and the system kind of takes care of the rest for me. All right, it's very, very cool and very, very powerful. Let's just go back to the slides real quickly. So we can customize elements, I mentioned that. We can do navigation. Whenever you create a secondary view by adding in a new root element, the system will then create navigation for you. And we can also do it through an action that you can put onto a string element as well. And this would also be true of styled string element since it derives from string element. And so whenever we get that action, we can use the navigation controller or we can use the present view controller like you're seeing here. Now, there's two other features that I want to promo real quickly, and then I'll show you an example of JSON. So the first one is MonoTouch actually supports the poll to refresh capability. So this was popularized with a Twitter application on iOS, and the idea is I can pull the table down and get it to refresh my data. And it's actually really, really easy to turn this feature on. And so if we switch back to our application here, I can actually go to my constructor here where I'm calling load data, and all I have to do to be able to turn this on is just call refresh requested, or rather wire up an event to refresh requested, and I'm going to call it on reload data. And so this will just be a method that we'll create. We'll put it right here, and in this method, when I call on reload data, I'm just going to say await load data. Let's put an async on that. And so now we'll go ahead and reload our data. Remember, load data sets root for us, and so this will go ahead and replace the current root with new data. Then I just have to tell the system that I'm done loading the data. And so the way we do that is we just call reload complete. When you call reload complete, it will get rid of the UI that represents the refresh. And so if we run this inside the simulator, it'll come up, hopefully. We get our data. So there, you saw the loading data there. When I pull this down, I get a loading, and then it reloaded my data. Let me do it again. So we release it, it loads my data, and when we call reload complete, the loading UI goes away. Okay, so that's pretty darn cool that you can get that out of the box just by setting an event. The second feature that we get out of the box is the search feature, and so it can actually place a search bar onto your UI. And this is also very easy to turn on. All you have to do is set enable search equal true. When you do this, it will create the UI for a search box, and it will automatically begin restricting based upon the search criteria itself. You can also set a search placeholder, and so I can say my search placeholder is going to be search for courses, okay? And then once we actually turn this on, again, let's just build it and run it, the system will automatically begin restricting based upon whatever we type. And so you can see I now get my search for courses. I click in here, I get a keyboard, I type iOS, or I could have obviously used this here, and notice then it restricts me down to iOS itself. Now, when I tap this, one of the things that's going to happen when I go back, notice that it's still filled in, and we still have keyboard focus. In other words, it didn't resign the first responder. We can actually get it to do that if we go to the select course here. Before we actually do the navigation, let's put in one more little call here. And what we're going to do is we're just going to tell it, go ahead and finish the search. All right, so there's a method here called finish search. This basically tells it to go ahead and release the keyboard so that we won't have keyboard selection at this time. There's a couple other things you can do. You can actually call a perform filter. There's a method where you can pass in a string to force it to do filtering. And then the other thing you do that, which is kind of cool, is there's an auto hide search that you can turn on, which will basically push the search box up to the top of the application, and you have to kind of pull it down slightly to get to it. The only problem with doing auto hide search is if you have this refresh requested turned on, it can get a little bit messy because we're pulling down to do that as well, and so sometimes we end up refreshing when what we really meant to do is show the search box. But it is a useful feature to know about. All right, so those are two great features that you should be aware of. So again, pull to refresh, where we basically wire up an event, and then we call reload complete on the UI thread once we've actually loaded up our UI with new data. And then the search support is just done by setting the enable search to true, and that does it all for you. So the last thing is actually pulling the data out of the UI. So I mentioned this when we were talking about the reflection API, and it just depends upon the model that you use to load the DialogViewController. So when you use the reflection model, recall that you had to use the binding context and call fetch. That will then go and get the results out of the UI and put them back into your object state. When you use the Fluent or JSON model, you can actually just go and read the data itself right out of the elements. And so they all have a value property of some form that lets you read the text or the value of the slider or whatever. And you can just read those. Now keep in mind you have to be on the UI thread to do it, and you have to know when they change. And that's really the troublesome area. So here's the reflection API, the binding context. We basically just call fetch when the view is disappearing. That'll pull our values back into the UI. When we're in the elements model or the JSON model, we just read them right from the elements themselves. And so in this case here, notice that I'm capturing the Boolean element when I create it. So here in the section, I'm caching it off to a field, and then I can hook into the value changed property on this Boolean element. And when it changes, I can read the state of that Boolean value and then kind of change my UI or do some sort of trigger within the UI that'll kind of control it. Most elements support detection of changes, and so Boolean element and image Boolean element and string element and radio element, checkbox element, datetime element, they all have either events or well, they're really just events. So there's events that get raised when those values actually change, so when the UI state changes, but not everything has this. And so in particular, the float element, which creates the slider, doesn't have this. And so one thing you can do is just simply basically derive a new class from the slider element, from the float element, and then in the viewDidLoad, go find the UI slider that it creates. And so it's just part of the content of the table cell that gets created. So override actually the getCell method is what you want. Call the base class to get it to generate the UI. And then when it comes back to you, reach in and go grab the slider right out of the subviews, and then just wire up a value changed event to the slider itself. And when you get a value changed, you raise your own event. So you would create your own public event on that slider float element, and then you would do whatever you need to do there. I'm going to put an example of this on my blog, and so I'll show you my blog address when we're finished here. and you can just go on the blog and download the slides for this event as well as the sample code. And I'll have an example of how to actually hook into the slider to be able to see that. All right. So there's one last thing I want to show you, and then we'll be done. And that is how to use the JSON model. And so to do that, I'm going to create one last application here. So I'm just going to add one last project in here. Again, I'm going to use the same one that we did before just to keep things consistent. Single view application, and let's call this Course Viewer JSON. And I have another little application that I've created that basically, let me just load it up really quickly. So I'm going to open up a new solution here. Open, and let's go to the desktop, DM. And I have this new solution here called Generate Offline Courses. And this uses that same DM courses data. And what this does, so this is actually just a mono program that's going to run here on my Mac. And it's actually going to go and use those same APIs, the JSON course reader, get courses, and it's going to generate a JSON stream with all of the little elements here, just like we did just a moment ago where we did it live. And so when I run this, it'll put it down here in my application output, hopefully. And we should see the data here. It does take a moment because it's pulling all the data. And so let me just go ahead and capture all this data here. So you can see here's all my JSON data. Go all the way to the top. It generated a ton of data. And so say, for instance, that we wanted to be able to have this course viewer, but we want it to be offline. So in other words, I don't want a live connection. So I'm going to basically generate my data here. Then let's go and open the original project that we were in. In fact, let's just open recents. That'll give it to us. So open recents, webcast. So here it is. And let's just add into this a new file. And so I'm going to put it right here, new file, into my resources. And let's just create a text file. We'll call it offline.txt. And let's just paste in the JSON. So here's the JSON itself, has a title, has sections, application architecture designer, has 2 courses, that's my footer. We have our elements, all right, where it's each course itself. And then notice the elements themselves actually has the HTML, the course name, the HTML for contact us. And so I just kind of made a simpler version, but it's essentially the same thing that we did before. Let's delete the nib file. I don't need that. So I'm just going to delete the nib file. I'm going to delete my designer file because I don't need that either. And I'm going to go ahead and take this and derive it from DialogViewController, just like we did before. Add in MonoTouch dialog. And now what I'm going to do is, let's go ahead and pass in null here for my base. We can get rid of both of these. And inside my course viewer JSON, I'm just going to say root is equal to JSON element from file. And I'm just going to tell it go load the offline.txt file. Okay? So it'll find it inside my resources here, right? Since this is now part of my bundle. And it should load it, and it should generate from this JSON a root element that I can then load into my DialogViewController. Let's set this as my startup project, and let's run this again. So the simulator comes up, and then notice I get all my data here. Just to prove that this is actually a new version of it, let's go ahead and set that, call that other constructor here that lets me set the table view style. And let's make it grouped for this second version here, all right, so that we get a different view for it. Just to prove that it's different. So notice now I get my data here. I'm going to pick one. So let's go to gorilla.net. And then notice it has my upcoming courses, it has my contact us, more information, and course name. If I click more information, it takes me to the web page. Now, we didn't make this a navigation controller, right? I didn't actually do that with this application, so I don't get a back button here. And so I'd have to do that. I'd have to go to the app delegate, make it a navigation view controller. But other than that, this now is an offline access app, so it does not require any of that data. So we could take this little application that I built that basically generates that JSON, and we can make it part of our actual iPhone app. So the very first time you run the app, it goes up to the website, it pulls the course data down, and dumps it offline. And then it goes ahead and loads that on subsequent runs, and then in the background, perhaps it goes up and loads the data if we happen to have some sort of data access, network access, either Wi-Fi or cellular access, to where we can do that. And so that's the JSON side, okay? And it's relatively easy to use. It's not terribly hard. Let me go ahead and minimize this to get back to our PowerPoint here. All right, so what we've seen is how to kind of take advantage real quickly of MonoTouch Dialog. MonoTouch Dialog will let you very easily build data-driven iOS-based applications where I'm getting this data, I can process this data and really quickly generate navigatable tables that kind of allow me to even create multiple levels of views, support searching and pull to refresh. All these features just come out of the box. This is an awesome technology. If you're using Xamarin.iOS, which I highly recommend if you're trying to target multiple platforms, but if you're using Xamarin.iOS, this is a great way to actually generate real quick apps that we can actually make almost fully functional just straight out with this API right here. Now let me show you my blog real quickly. So you'll be able to get all this data, and like I said, I'll have some other samples up here. If you go to julemar.com/blog/mark, you'll be able to pull down both the slides that are here as well as these samples, and I'll put a link to the webcast as well on here. So once the webcast is all finished and we've got it recorded, I'll put a link up here on my blog as well. So thank you so much for attending. I appreciate your time this morning, and I hope everyone has a great day.